Okay, let's see here. You're not able to share?
No, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
That is interesting. Let's see here. Can you try it now?
Mm-hmm. There we go.
Perfect. Okay, so again, welcome Michelle from Carabiner Group. She's going to be taking us through flows, a triggering experience.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Small caveat, this is actually a presentation I put together for an admin audience with the goal of introducing admins to programmatic automation in Salesforce. When I was approached to present this to a developers group, I was really intrigued about kind of flipping it over the other way and using it as a way of introducing the developer community to some of the declarative way to do automation kind of going forward in Salesforce. So I'm really excited, and I'd love to hear your feedback along the way. Please feel free to unmute yourself to ask questions. I will try to keep an eye on the chat box, but I am notoriously bad at that. So like I said, feel free to unmute and interrupt, and I'll definitely leave room for questions at the end as well. All right, so in this presentation, I'll first let you know a little bit of who I am and why I think I know what I'm talking about when it comes to triggers and flows. And then I like to kind of dig down into the different options you have in terms of Salesforce automation and go through some scenarios of like when to use which type of automation. And then I'll do a quick demo, basically comparing an Apex trigger to the exact same functionality in a flow, so you can kind of compare how they're similar and how they're different. And then I like to talk about trigger and flow management and how kind of the philosophies around that are similar and different. And then of course, I'll leave time for your questions at the end. But like I said, feel free to interrupt me anytime during the presentation. All right, so I am currently the Tulsa Salesforce user group leader, at least as long as I'm here. I'm also the manager of delivery at Carabiner Group. I am a certified system architect, and only because it is after 5 p.m. for me right now do I not have a cup of coffee. I've switched over to water, but normally if you see me or my trail emoji around, I have a cup of coffee in my hand, and the best way to reach me, I'm also on LinkedIn and all the social medias, but you can always find me on Twitter. All right. So first, going into when to use what. And so first, I like to think of like when you're making a decision of whether to use a trigger or a flow to do the automation, because honestly, with every new release, the answer, it can only be done with a trigger, is becoming less and less the case, which doesn't necessarily mean there isn't a case for using code to do automation in Salesforce. It's just that the way you consider it is a little bit different. So generally, I start with, is there already a trigger for this object? One thing I try to avoid, or I recommend that my clients avoid, is that you don't want to have a mix of automations in a lot of different places without, some solid documentation around it, because it makes debugging a nightmare, right? You don't necessarily know which automation is causing the problem, what's doing what where, and you're relying on both the administrator and your developer group to try kind of figure out and manage the automation of your system. So generally, if there's already a trigger for the object, then it's a good idea to kind of stay within that trigger environment and leverage that trigger to manage all of the automation. With the caveat of there are definitely times where I have recommended that clients pull out the automation in all of their triggers and replace them with flows. And that's usually in the case of organizations where they don't have a developer resource. They can't afford a developer resource, or they have no plans or no budget to afford a developer resource. And so they've just built themselves into this position where they're relying on a bunch of code, but they have no way to monitor it, to support it, or to debug it. But they do have a Salesforce administrator. So either it's you invest in turning your Salesforce administrator into a developer, or you need to pull your automation out of code kind of as much as possible. So that's my one little caveat there. Again, if there isn't an existing Apex trigger, I tend to recommend going toward the record trigger flows because they have so much functionality, and because after this presentation, all of you, as well as your admin counterparts, will be able to kind of look and see and understand what the automation is doing and be able to troubleshoot it. So it won't always be on you to provide support. If there's an error in the automation, the admins will be able to support that as well. And then the other one has to do with just kind of like org development, right? There are orgs that are managed by teams of developers, or they have a developer house that they contract out to manage their org. And developers live in the code, right? They live in Apex, they live in Salesforce DX. So there's no reason to kind of port everything over to declarative automation. There's no inherent advantage to moving from triggers to flows. And then on the other side, if the org development is primarily done or managed by administrators, you're probably going to want to stick with flows because, again, that's where they live, in the declarative functionality of Salesforce. I think these two functions, undelete and preventing deletion, are still not available in record triggered flows. I have to update this presentation with every release, so this is probably going to change in the next year or a couple of years. But right now, you cannot do a record triggered flow on undelete, and you cannot configure a record triggered flow to cause an error or to surface an error message that would prevent a record from being deleted, because it won't let you save the flow. It's considered like an error with the flow configuration. So if you want to prevent the deletion of a record, you still would need to use a trigger for that. Also, just by the very nature of the way the declarative functionality is architected versus the way that code works in Salesforce, for large data volume orgs, Apex triggers are always going to be more efficient than record triggered flows. I'd say possibly with the exception of the record trigger flows that happen before the save. But by and large, if you're dealing with millions and millions of records, you're probably going to want to rely more on the Apex triggers because of their ability to kind of batch and bulkify their functionality. Any questions here?
On that last point, do you have a good cutoff on when number of records would push you into the triggers?
5,004,379.
Awesome.
No, yeah, plus or minus few. I usually say if you're dealing with more than 8 million of a record, but if you go and do like the Salesforce trailheads on large data volumes, I think they put the cutoff at 5 million.
At 5, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so either way, also like if you already have 2 million, you're not planning for where your org is today, right? You're planning for where it is in
Where it
like
will be.
10 years. So if you're already at a couple million, you should be planning for,
Yeah.
5 million and 8 million. Great question. Anything else? All right. So this is a very, very summarized version of the save order of execution, right? I think even in this last release, it's gotten more complex than anything I could fit on a single slide. But essentially, I bring this up to kind of flag one of the major differences between triggered flows and triggered apex. So for example, when we're talking about the before triggered flows, they actually happen before the before triggers. So all of your record triggered before flows will fire before any of your before apex triggers. For the after triggers, though, you have your apex after triggers happening up here, and then the record triggered after flows are way down here. So they're after workflow rules, they're after process builders, if those still exist in your org, after escalation, entitlement, auto response, assignment rules, in the same order of execution, unlike the after triggers. So just another kind of major difference when you're looking at how flows are going to operate in your system as compared to the expected behavior of apex triggers. All right. So I translate this because they used to call flows before and after flows, but they have since kind of renamed them to make them a little more user friendly. But essentially, fast field update is a before flow. It works with the same kind of functionality as a before trigger, right? You don't need the record ID, and if it's an insert, it's a new record. If it's an update, it's an existing record. Again, insert is called a new record is created in the flow language. Update is called a record is updated. So pretty similar language. And then before is fast field updates. After is actions and related records. So basically anything that would require the record ID needs to be after. Anything that doesn't require the record ID needs to be before. Same logic as when you're building out triggers. Right. When it comes to scheduling, really a scheduled triggered flow, the biggest limitation there right now, I say, is that it can only run a maximum of once a day, and it can only run on like a consistent cadence. So once a day, once a week, once a year. You can't say first Wednesday of the month or second week on Friday or the 5th day of the month or something like that. If you need to use a cron job, that has to be Apex. If it needs to be more frequently than once a day, needs to be Apex. Right now, if it needs to make API calls, that also has to be done with Apex. That said, in your scheduled Apex flow, in your scheduled Apex code, you can call an automated flow. So it's the equivalent of a headless flow rather than a scheduled flow. It would just be just a plain automated flow, and you can call the automation from Apex. So you can put the scheduling in code if it's complex scheduling requirements, but the actual automation and the functionality itself can be built as a flow. Any questions about that? When do you use process builders and workflow rules? I'm sure this has been drilled into everybody's head, but in case, I know y'all aren't admins, so you might not hear this enough. We're no longer using process builders and workflow rules, right? In fact, we can't use your workflow rules anymore. You cannot create new workflow rules, and you should not create new process builders. If you are working with admins who are creating process builders, sound the alarm immediately. These are 100% replaceable by flows today. All right, I'm gonna pop over to my demo. And I'm going to start with the trigger, and let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. No, I can't. All right, my developer console is not being very friendly today. So this is a very simple trigger, right? It's just running as an after update trigger. And basically the use case is when the owner of an account changes, update the owner for all of the contacts under that account to match the account owner. So in my trigger, and I'll add the asterisk where there are some non-best practices in this code. I did them on purpose. I'm going to claim I did all of them on purpose because I use them to talk about best practices with the admin audience. Y'all know the coding best practices, but feel free to shout it out and I will pretend like I absolutely did it on purpose. But anyway, just kind of straightforward, pulling a list of all of the, a map of all of the trigger elements. If the owner ID is changed, adding them to this list, and then sending the list as a parameter to the update contact owners method in my Apex class. And then if I jump over to the Apex class, again, I'm just looking up all of the contacts that are related to the account and then updating the contact owner to equal the account owner and then updating all of those contacts. So pretty simple trigger. Any questions about the trigger or the class? All right. So now I'm going to jump over to the flow that does exactly the same thing and kind of point out how they're similar and how they're different. So first of all, let me just kind of back up to what creating a new flow looks like and talk through what the different elements mean. So there are 6 different kinds of flows. I put 6 in parentheses because orchestration is specific to Flow Orchestrator, which is kind of like a flow on steroids. It's a paid feature. So if your org doesn't have it, you won't see this option in your actual org, but you can play with it in a dev org. Screen flow is not something I'm covering because it's not automated at all. It is it's essentially the building of a user interface with some back-end functionality and automation that you build into a flow. So you can think of it like a visual force page or even like a lightning component. You can put in that user interface is what you build in as a screen flow. It requires user interaction in order to move forward. Schedule triggered flow is what we talked about. You can schedule it for as frequently as 1 a day or as infrequently, I think, as once a year. An auto launched flow is a flow that has to be invoked by something. So it can be invoked by an Apex class. It can be invoked by a process builder, except we don't use process builder anymore. You can invoke it from the REST API, etc. It runs in the background, but it has to be invoked by something else, otherwise it won't run. The record triggered flow is what launches based on the same trigger criteria when a record is created, updated, or deleted. Like I mentioned before, undeleted is not yet an option. You can also do flows that are triggered on platform events. And it is similar to an auto launch flow. It's just triggered by a platform event instead of Apex or Process Builder or REST API. And then record triggered orchestration, I'm not really going to go into, but it's a big, hairy flow. If you think of like a trigger handler, that's kind of like what you would build in kind of a record triggered orchestration. All right, I'm gonna back up. And so what I created here is a record triggered flow. And the first thing it will ask you to do is configure the start, which is kind of the header object. And so a lot of this stuff is just a UI version of what you would normally type to set up your trigger, right? Like this is a trigger on account, after update. So here I go up when a record is updated. And then down here, I select after, which as we know in flow language, that's actions and related records. And then I can set some entry conditions, kind of the same way that I set conditions within my trigger with the if statement. So that's exactly what I've set up in this flow. I've just set conditions that the owner ID is changed. So this is the one cool feature of flow. I get this is changed operator. So I don't have to create maps. I don't have to compare them. The back end of Salesforce does this all for me when I select this option on the page. But just so you can see, it has kind of the standard condition operators, equals, does not equal, starts, ends, contains, null, and is changed. Right. The one kind of different thing, and this kind of harks back to workflow rules and process builders, is that you can select that this flow runs every time the record is updated and happens to meet the condition requirements, or only when a record is updated specifically to meet the condition requirements. Right, so every time a record is updated means if the owner ID was changed in some previous process or was changed for some previous reason, I guess this change is not, but if I said something like if owner ID equals XYZ, if the owner ID equals XYZ and I made a different update, like I updated the account name, this flow would fire because it meets the conditions. If I select only when a record is updated to meet the condition requirements, that means that only when I change the owner ID to this specific value will it cause this flow to fire. So if I do is changed, that option's not available to me because I'm essentially saying that, right? I'm essentially saying only when the record is updated to change the owner ID, run this flow. So it sort of nullifies this, but that's why that exists, and it's kind of a holdover from workflow rules and process builder. They have those options built in there. All right. And then finally, I mean, this is something you can configure in your classes, but you can select an asynchronous path. So you can have something run at a later scheduled time, like in 5 minutes, in in an hour, etc. And you can create different paths. So you can have, I'll turn that on, a path of what runs now and a path of what runs essentially either asynchronously when resources are available or after a specific period of time. All right. So next part of my flow, and you'll see like the header part, the stuff in the start menu, this is what you put in your trigger traditionally. And then all of these actions down here or what you would put in your class and your methods, right? So the first thing I'm doing is get related contacts. This is the SOCL query that was in my code. So again, getting contacts that meet the condition of having that account ID, pulling all records, and pulling these two fields from the records. Some options that I also have is that I can automatically have the flow store all the fields. For it, I can just decide which specific fields, which is best practice for flow, because you don't want to overload your flow with a bunch of fields and variables that you don't need to use. So generally you choose this one where it says choose fields and let Salesforce do the rest, and it'll pull these into a variable that it creates automatically. Or you can choose fields and assign each field in the object to its own variable. Right, and then here I have my for loop. So again, I am just looping through this variable that was created from the get action called get related contacts. And then you just tell it which direction. Usually doesn't matter unless you did some sorting on the list that you created, but by default goes from first to last. And then as I'm going through the flow, the first thing I do, the flow always goes in the wrong direction that I suspect. So first thing it does for the current item in the loop, I update the current item's owner ID to the record that triggered the flow. So that's going to be the account records owner ID. And this is just an assignment. I could do an update and just update the contact in here, but the admins follow the same rules and flows as developers. You do not put DML statements in a for loop. In a loop, the same thing goes for flows. You do not put actions, which are just the pink boxes, in a for loop, because we have the same governor limits with declarative Salesforce as we do with programmatic Salesforce, right? So if there's more than 150 contacts assigned to the account, you're going to get an error, a limit error. Sorry, did someone have a question? Or are we just unmuted by accident? All right. All right, and then step 2, again, because I don't want to do my DML statement or my action inside my flow, I created a list called contacts update. If you look back at my class, I have the same list right here. And I am just adding this current loop item, which is the contact, to the list here. And then after I have gone through all of the contacts, done all of those assignments, I have my DML statement, my action. And this is just updating the contact records based on the list that I've created contacts to update. When you're doing a record update from a record triggered flow, you have a couple of options here. You can quickly just say, I'm updating the account that triggered the flow. And that way you don't have to do any type of searching or criteria setting, specification. You just tell it what fields you want to update, or if you want to update with the contents of a variable. You can also update records that are related to the flow. So you could do just a mass update of all of the contacts that are related to the account that triggered the flow, and do your mass contact update that way. Or you could use the IDs and field values from a record or record collection. So that's kind of what I went through with this flow. I built a record collection, which is just a list. And I'm using that to do the update based on the assignments that I did. Or you can do it completely manually, specify specific conditions, again, similar to a SOCL query, to identify the records that you want to update, and then you manually set what the fields you want to populate are. And that is the end of my flow. Any questions on how the flow functions or what's kind of different? Did anybody notice like the big hairy difference between the flow and my code? All right, I'll give you a hint. So if I do a mass update of account owners, I'm updating like 100 records and changing the account owner on all of them. How many times is this trigger going to be called?
If you're doing 100 records at once, it's just one call to this trigger.
One call. How many times is this flow going to be called?
It's 100 times, isn't it?
100, yes, because record triggered flows are record singular triggered flows, right? So every record that's updated will trigger this flow. And that is why I continue to make the caveat of the Apex code is always going to be more efficient because you can batch it, right? You can run it in batches. You cannot do that with record triggered flows. And that is why the after triggers, the actions and related records, record triggered flows can become very expensive in terms of the transactions. Right. Now I want to talk about trigger management, because the way that we think about structuring triggers in Apex is a little bit different from how Salesforce has essentially kind of recommended the organization of triggers, or at least record triggered flows. So this is kind of a basic idea of trigger management in Apex, right? You have your single object trigger. It has all of your instances. You put your business logic in the trigger, and then you have your various Apex class methods that do your functionality. So you can call whichever method you need to for whichever instance, right? If there's something you need to call before insert and before update, you can do that. You don't have to write the code twice. And if there's something you only want to call in one instance or the other, then you just call it when you need to call it. Easy peasy, right? This is standard developer best practices. So when it comes to flows, you could do that, right? You could have a record triggered flow that essentially calls a bunch of automated flows or headless flows or subflows, depending on what word you'd like to use, and structure it essentially the same way. So there's a record triggered flow is your trigger. It's where your business logic is. And the automated flows that it calls are all of the actions that are actually happening. The other side is workflow rules, the OG declarative automation tool in Salesforce. And the way workflow rules work is that every single set of criteria is a new workflow rule, right? So if you have a specific criteria for when an object meets these conditions, do this, that's a workflow rule. If you have a different set of conditions, you create a different workflow rule. And so you end up with lots and lots of workflow rules for a particular object. You don't have one workflow rule calling multiple different actions for a single object. And the reason that the recommendation is for record trigger flows is to use them more like workflow rules is because Salesforce built this really cool tool called the Flow Trigger Explorer. So it essentially pulls in all of the triggers that meet different conditions for, for example, when an account record is created. And I can pop over to my screen and open up Flow Trigger Explorer. So here I have when an account record is updated. Here's my flow here. So I can see kind of in order what's going to happen, where the fast field updates, the before triggers, the action and related records, the after triggers, and then everything that's running asynchronously. I can also edit the order here. So if I have multiple fast field updates and actions and related records, I can edit the order that they fire in, which is not something that we could do with any other declarative automation tool in Salesforce. So the admins are very, very excited about this. And because of that, there's not really a need to build that logic into a flow because essentially your business logic is here, right? And this is where you determine when things should fire and what order they should fire in. And then you can set your criteria inside each individual flow. And that adds an additional layer of efficiency because if an account does not meet this criteria, the flow is not called, right? None of the decisions that you build into the flow, none of the actions, it does not take up any type of transactional time, or it's negligible transactional time because it's bypassing the flow if it doesn't meet these conditions. If you set up a record triggered flow where it's essentially going to run every time an account is updated with no criteria, and the criteria is built into the flow, the entire flow is going to run every time. So it's going to go through every single decision element in the flow, even if the account record does not meet any of the criteria. It's going to take up some transaction time. So that's the other reason you can build more efficiency into the way that your flows work, because you can put the conditions in the start box rather than having to build them into your the flow itself. Right. Any questions about Flow Trigger Explorer or kind of how that works or why flow management is a little different from trigger management in Apex?
Michelle, are you going to cover how to debug flows, or at least if you had multiple things firing on one trigger, like that last example, you would know which one it failed on?
Yeah, that is a really great question. So the short answer is I haven't built it into this presentation because there is actually a flow debugger that just came out with flows, and it's really cool. You can actually build essentially test classes for your flows. But before this was created, honestly, the way that most people tested their flows was they built it in a sandbox and then they did a bunch of like tests in the sandbox to see if it worked. There's a flow debug tool, but it works on real records. So you still have to kind of build your test out in the sandbox. Some folks, if they have like a really strong developer presence, will actually build Apex test classes to test their flows, and run through that as they're making updates in sandboxes as well. But there is a new tool, and I can jump over and show it. So you can actually create tests inside your flows, and you can create multiple tests and then have these tests run as you before you deploy them between sandboxes or between orgs. So essentially you create the data that you need and then put the assertions in, and then it'll run your tests and tell you whether it passed or failed. The thing I really like about this is it forces you to make the assertions. So no cheating just to get 100% or 80% plus code coverage. You have to have assertions built into your tests. That said, there is no code coverage requirement for flows yet. It's not required to make any of the test flows, but I do like that it kind of builds in those assertions. And it's I haven't gotten to play with this as much as I would like to, but it's definitely something worth looking at.
Thank you. That was going to be my next question, was code coverage.
Yes, no code coverage requirement for the declarative stuff. Ha 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 ha. Yes, evil laughter from all of the admins. I see there's a question from Jess. If you have more than one subflow in the flow trigger explorer, the queries on each subflow will be run, right? So a subflow actually doesn't show up in flow trigger explorer. This is only the record triggered flows. A subflow would be an automated flow. So it would have to be called. It could either be called by one of the record triggered flows or by something else in your system, by Apex, by REST API, etc. So it wouldn't actually show up here. So the screen flows, the scheduled flows, and the automated flows don't show up here because they're not tied to an object and a DML action. In Apex, you can do one query that helps for all your future subflows. Is there something that can simulate that? I don't know if I understand the question. Jess, could you unmute yourself and maybe clarify a little bit what you're asking there? Oh, okay. So you can pass variables from your record triggered flow to the subflows if that's what you're asking for. So if you did a query in the record triggered flow, for example, you could put it in a collection variable and pass that variable down to your subflows. Is that, yes, okay, yes. All right. Cool. Any other questions about Apex trigger management versus flow trigger management? All right, y'all. Well, that is my presentation. I really enjoyed talking to you. Happy to ask any other questions on flows and triggers or Salesforce in general if you have them.
Awesome, Michelle. Thank you so much for giving this presentation. I actually learned something today, which is great. So I hadn't really used the debugger yet. So that was really cool to see that in action, you know, see the stuff with that. So, you know, great job. I really appreciate, you know, this is, I feel like I think everybody's, you know, we're getting lots of chatter on the chat here, you know, great presentation. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful evening and enjoy your Florida weather. I'm very jealous.
All right. Thank you. Take care, everybody.